let's say a few more things about the Vikings, and then, who knows, even finish a little bit early. I am cooking Thai red beef curry tonight, so I need to go and buy the ingredients for that. Takes a while. Ravel?
Any indications as to why the culture suddenly became so violent and expansive at 800? Was it just the ships?
That's my next question, okay? Thank you for asking that. Well, firstly, to step back from that, of course, as we were saying before, the Viking period, the Viking Age, whatever we want to call it, is associated in the popular mind with Hagar the Horrible and the violent activities, killing abbots and things like that. As we were saying, we are, from a broader perspective and by looking at other evidence, we can see that these Scandinavian men and some women were doing lots of different things. We showed this map before of the trade routes, okay? And we'll come back to this a bit later on. Perhaps on Friday, Oksana, you said you'd read a bit about the Pyrenean thesis and so on. Are we going to talk about that? Or? Right, okay, but I'll come back to this point. But there is an idea by this...
I might mention the idea, but I'm not going to talk about it.
Right, yeah, but okay, mention the idea a little bit. But this shift in kind of cultural life in Europe northwards away from the Mediterranean, because all those terrible Muslims had taken over most of the Mediterranean, so that the Christian Europeans ended up focusing their lives this kind of a way or whatever. And trade is obviously very important, how you get things from the east or whatever. So we find even before the Vikings, the Frisians had been very important in trading in the north or whatever. Pirenne suggested that this kind of thing, and the Vikings later, it's a kind of response to the fact that suddenly that the Mediterranean is not a peaceful Christian sea where they can travel around easily and do trade. So that might be one explanation of that side of things we can think about. But trading is one thing. Also settling. They went around finding new places and living there, sometimes successfully, like in the case of Iceland, which is still a Scandinavian country today, okay? For a while successful in Greenland until it was like the 16th century when finally the Scandinavians all died out there of the cold. And for a short amount of time, as we see even in North America, they go around settling in various places. And all those dots on the map in the north of England we saw showing lots of Vikings settling there. So not just coming and killing, but coming and staying for various reasons. So the first point we want to make, and we'll look at some of these things today and maybe on Friday in more detail, is that the Viking Age was a complex period in European history involving Scandinavians doing some nice things and some nasty things, okay, depending on your perspective and who you were, and other people doing those things as well. And we don't even have to assume that all the Vikings were necessarily Scandinavian. They may have been Celts and Anglo-Saxons and French people who just joined in and so on and things like that. So it's not quite as simple as our Hagar picture here suggests. But that brings us then to one of the most important historical questions, is why. Okay, we spend a lot of time saying who, what, where and when, but in history it's the how and the why questions that are the things which make graduate students get very excited when they wake up in the morning and think, oh, I want to go to the library or switch on my computer because I want to know why this or that. And obviously historians, archaeologists and others have debated the why side, which is Ravel's question. And there's no perfect answer to that. Partly because we were dealing with a long period of time, hundreds of years, dealing with lots of very different people, as I said, doing very different things in different places. And as a consequence, we can't offer a single explanation of why. And obviously some things also we can think about as when we look at causality in history, there's long-term and there's short-term. Okay, there's short-term things which cause you immediately to behave in a certain way, but then we might look at the bigger perspective of someone's background and their culture which allows them to do things. Then we have the kind of push and pull side. Some things push you to do things, you just leave somewhere. Other things pull you in. Other things are attracting you to a certain behavior rather than forcing you away from another behavior. So we can't, again, simplify things. So I've just written down here a few things which historians have suggested. One of them is demographics. Overpopulation, that in Scandinavia, in the Scandinavian lands, there was a growing population of people living there, that perhaps climate was deteriorating and the amount of land which was cultivatable and livable on was perhaps reduced. So you had more people and less land, and therefore that's definitely a push thing that would lead to some people, perhaps especially the guys, to leave and want to find a way of living, land or other means of living elsewhere. On the other hand, it's often said that the very early Viking period, from, let's say, round about 790 down to round about the 840s, well, the first 50 years or so of Viking activity, they were not full-time Vikings. Guys who perhaps during the summer would go and do some Viking stuff when the weather was nice, get in their ship with their friends and sail around or whatever. And then later on in the autumn, they'd go back to their farms, perhaps in Norway, perhaps in the islands to the north of Britain or whatever, and settle down and look after their farms until the weather got nicer, and then they could sail again during the summer. It was only after this time that they began to settle down and form groups that seemed to be doing kind of full-time Viking stuff and staying over the summer and over the winter, in England and elsewhere. So the pressure on land may be one factor, but then lots of guys possibly were being Vikings part of the year, but had land back in Scandinavia or elsewhere anyway. So they weren't forced to become pirates, and that was it, in a sense. So that doesn't give us a perfect, perhaps, answer. The boat thing is very important, okay? The technology they used, I remember reading a few books about this when I was an undergraduate, clinker bill, the things they did at the bottom of the boats and so on, that allowed them to sail in the deeper waters. Most people in early medieval Europe basically kind of sailed along the coastlands and didn't go into the deeper waters in case they couldn't manage it. Their ships couldn't hack that kind of situation. The Viking ships could, which is why they could sail across the North Atlantic and elsewhere. But of course, just because you've got some good boats doesn't mean you have to become bastards and go around killing people, okay? So it's a means to doing all sorts of things, but it doesn't explain necessarily in particular why you all go around attacking other people and things like that. So it's part of the mix. It gave them the chance to trade and to settle and to raid, but it doesn't give the only explanation for that. Some people have suggested it wasn't kind of social, economic, it was political. They say that during the Viking period we see a growing political centralization. All right? And as one guy makes himself king of all or most of a region, expands his power, then other guys, the little kings, the little earls, the jarls as they were called and so on, they feel under pressure, okay, because they're his political rivals. And at a certain point, it's a good idea to get out and go somewhere else and go end up in Iceland. And Iceland was, for a long time, a kind of haven for political refugees of one sort or another and things like that. And in his Icelandic tradition in particular, they often refer to the first person who became effectively king of what is now Norway, the whole of Norway, Harald Finehair, okay, as the person who somehow people were leaving because he was taking over and pushing them out. There's a legend associated with that, his nickname, Finehair, because he basically said when he was young, okay, I'm not going to wash my hair or shave until I'm king of all of Norway. And for a few decades, he was a kind of smelly, undesirable guy. But eventually he became king of all Norway. Then he washed his hair, and they all said, oh, what lovely hair you've got. And then he became known as Finehair. And obviously that doesn't have a lot of truth in it. But the problem for us is if any of these things really went on, and we're using the sagas to look at this, so it's all very uncertain, he was probably living around about the year 900, about 100 years later than the Viking things get going. So it might explain some guys going to Iceland at a certain point. It doesn't give an explanation for the Viking period. Denmark, we see evidence in the Carolingian chronicles and so on from about 100 years earlier of political centralization or whatever. So we do see some consolidation there. So it might work for some Danes. I'm not sure about that and so on. Okay. So we can carry on. Various political, social, personal, technological reasons. It's probably a big mixture of all of them, okay? And there's no real perfect answer, as I said. And those of you who are working, if there's anyone working on, well, you've done it now, of course, if you've worked on the essay where I want you to compare the Germanic period of settling with the Viking period, one thing will be to look at the causes and say, were they caused by different factors, and then what does that lead to, and things like that. It's an interesting way of putting things together, and so on. So, let me say a little bit about the chronology then. Let's do a bit of whens and so on, because we have to do these things anyway, okay? We have archaeological evidence, not really historical evidence. We've got archaeological evidence which suggests that up in these northern islands, the Orkneys and so on up here, there was some Scandinavian settlement probably earlier in the 8th century, so before the Viking period really began, which is the sort of later part of the 8th century, we have evidence that some Scandinavians had sailed across here and had settled, okay? Some of them may have been the guys who were doing the raiding. It may have not necessarily been all the people from the homeland in Norway, okay? But as I read earlier, it's 789 in England that we have the first reference to something which we can call Vikings. These guys who come and the reeve goes and then they kill him. Okay, and these are the first time the Norwegians or the Danes, whoever it was, come to England. So we're talking, as I said, round about here. A couple of years later, 793, we have a very famous attack. Well, it's up here. So on a monastery off the main coast. It's on a little island, which I think Murat was just mentioning, Lindisfarne, okay? And this was attacked by some Vikings. And even Alcuin, remember we were talking about this English scholar who was at Charlemagne's court last week, he got to hear about this, and he was obviously quite upset. What he says in one of his letters is that, obviously, God is punishing us. God is punishing the English people because of we're bad people, we're sinful or whatever, and this is God's punishment. And he even quotes from the Old Testament. I've got the quotation here, okay, from the book, from the prophet Jeremiah. It says, "Then the Lord said unto me, out of the north, and evil shall break forth upon the inhabitants of the land." Now, obviously, they're not talking about England there at all, but somehow from the north they're coming, and so they're using. Now, where have we heard this before? Where have we heard some guys come, some guys attack us, some guys are being nasty? It's God's punishment. We've had this pretty much same message before. Again, weeks ago. No. Probably, but the one we mentioned specifically, I mean, maybe you did that in your presentation, I can't remember. Gildas, that British priest writing that, well, a sermon, as I said, really trying, and basically saying the English are coming, the Saxons are coming, it's God's punishment because we're being sinful, like the Jews in the Hebrew peoples in the Old Testament when God punished them and things like that. So this is a typical Christian topos, and in a context where you believe in God and the Christian world, then it's a valid way of explaining things. Okay, it's not valid for modern historians, obviously, but that was his take on it. We have the first reference to a raid on Ireland a couple of years after that, so moving to the other side of the British Isles, and then the first attack on what is now France and the Carolingian lands, 799. I just wrote those dates down. Saint Philibert, important monastery there, and so on. And this form of activity, okay, carries on, as I said, until during the 840s. So there seem to be small groups of people coming, attacking churches especially, presumably attacking other places as well, but churches because they're relatively wealthy, kind of snap and grab, and then they go away. And this is what it's like for 40, 50 years or so. Then eventually we have a different situation. We have groups that decide, as I said before, not to go home after they've finished, but to stay. And they build themselves temporary encampments of one sort or another, sometimes called long forts, okay, and then they decide to stay for the winter. Okay, and I can't remember the exact date now, but the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes very clearly. Okay, here we are. 850 was when the Danes, it says, first wintered in England, when they stayed there. This army that was moving around didn't just leave when the weather got a bit cold. It decided to stay because it could still benefit from that. That changes things. When they're staying, even if it's still basically guys with swords staying, it changes the nature of the relationship. So from that point onwards, from the late 840s, we see a shift in the nature of activity. They begin to see it as more of a permanent thing, because we can get something out of this, in a sense, okay? And that's very, very, very important for us. Now for England, let's just put this other map up now. In the 870s, we see a very large army called the Great Army of kind of Viking guys, and we know the names of the leaders. There's a couple of leaders and so on of this army that's going around doing nasty things. Basically comes and over a short period of time destroys almost all of the independent Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, okay? Takes over or just kills the kings or puts someone else there as a client for a few years and gets rid of him, okay? Basically, all this area up here essentially was politically taken over by Vikings. And only the kingdom in the south here, the kingdom of the West Saxons, Wessex, was able to survive. And it was the English king, do we know the name? Anyone know? No, good guess though, but Alfred. Probably one of the reasons why Alfred is still occasionally used as a name in England. Alfredo, you can obviously it goes elsewhere. But Alfred the Great was a fairly young king of the Wessex, who eventually, although it looked like he was going to lose his kingdom as well at one point, was able to fight back and resist. And then he's in such a strong position eventually, he's able to negotiate with these guys. He can't at that point kind of get rid of them, he can't fight back. But they negotiate this line here, which we can reconstruct from historical accounts, and say, okay, north of there, this becomes the Danelaw, where the law of the Danes reigns. And south of there, it's Wessex, it's my kingdom, okay? And this is the line that they've put on here from the historical documents. They've put the dots on to show the place names that have Scandinavian elements. And look, apart from a few round here, there's hardly any dots south of that line. The line did work. There was hardly any Scandinavian settlement, if the place names are reliable in that kind of a sense, okay? So it tells us what was going on. So that's the picture in England, and it was only in the next 100 years that Alfred's successors are able to reconquer the rest of northern England, and then they make it England. Then they don't say, let's have all these separate kingdoms. They say, this is ours, and it becomes the Kingdom of England at that point. So the Vikings very important in creating the unity which becomes England later on, okay? And it's over the next, well, not 100 years, but 60 years or so as they push their way further up generation after generation. But for a long time, there was a very important Viking kingdom based at the city of York, okay, which was could have gone on to become a more permanent thing if history had been different. Let's just contrast that map with, this is my own map, Ireland. I've marked and written in the places that we have Vikings settled in, active from, and so on. We saw Dublin mentioned, what's that, the capital city of Dublin mentioned a lot, and this area here was pretty much controlled by Vikings. It becomes a Viking, the other big Viking kingdom in Europe, in a sense. What do you see, if you look at this map, what patterns emerge? This gives us a kind of visual idea of the Vikings in Ireland. Very different from what we saw in England. What patterns do we see here?
Settled on the shores?
Yeah, it's mostly coastal and going on to some of these large lakes, the lochs, okay? is where they were active from. And they like these fjords. A fjord is this kind of inroad into the land. It becomes in Carling Ford, Waterford. These are all Scandinavian names now, and so on. Some of these places are Irish names and so on, but many of them are Scandinavian. They're settled around the coast. Dublin was the biggest kingdom. Some of these were very impermanent. Waterford was quite important, and Limerick as well became little sort of miniature kingdoms, miniature Irish kingdoms, which eventually fit into the Irish scene and become, until the English arrived, had their own character as well. But it's very much a coastal thing, okay? They don't come along and take over half of the area. They have these kingdoms based on the coast and in the lakes. Show very quickly a map of Wales. Though there are some debate these days. This is a map showing places that have got some kind of Scandinavian element in place names in Wales. While we're here, I come from just about there, but my village is not marked on the map. It's not Scandinavian name. What do we notice here? It's similar, but a bit different. What's going on in this one here? What's the obvious pattern here, to a large extent? Well, there's a lot going on down here, particularly in Dyfed in the south, yes. These are not so, but mostly, again, it's coastal area, you can see. A little bit in the north as well. The interesting thing is, with the exception of Bardsey Island here, there's nothing really all the way along there. So what does that suggest? Any ideas? And if we look at these names, some of which still survive, some of them that they don't, but they come from historical sources, they're not necessarily referring to settlements. They're referring to points, things you can see. Okay, Orm's Head here. This is an area is very popular holiday town called Llandudno in North Wales. Okay, you can go up round Orm's Head and so on, which means like Worm's Head or something like that. But most of these names, a lot of them refer not to places; they refer to points on the coast. As if when you're sailing, you say, okay, you set off, you go past Kelston, then look out for Orm's Head, and then that way. Okay. And it's probably, they suggested, that most of these are not settlements, they're just places where the Vikings were using them when they were sailing along the coast, trading and going to Ireland or elsewhere. So this is very unimportant, because this was the route out to Ireland and into the Atlantic, and that was another slightly less important route from perhaps Chester, and this is from Bristol, which becomes, in England, a very important place. So these are places which are just points on the kind of compass as you sail around. There's been some talk about maybe there's been more Viking activity in Wales, but in the old days we said that basically there wasn't much Viking activity. These are just points that they look out for as they sail around, so it's part of their trading network in a sense. To finish off, here's evidence from place names and so on from the north of Britain, and the Isle of Man there's been moved up and so on. Okay, heavy settlement in Shetland and the Orkneys. Okay, over here in the north of Scotland we have dots a little bit more, and then we move down Hebrides a bit less, and so on. And DNA evidence supports that. They look at the DNA of people living up there now. They've got Scandinavian stuff. The further we move along here, a bit less, and so on. But the centre of Scotland kind of survived in that sense for a while, apart from this cluster around here and there, and so on. So Vikings came and raided. Then, during the later part of the 9th century into the 10th century, they began to settle and take over. Okay, and Normandy, I mentioned before, in the 10th century becomes a little Viking kind of a kingdom, but eventually becomes a duchy and becomes integrated into France. And those guys were pretty much French by the end of things, and so on. In addition, as we said, they went further beyond. As we mentioned before, they go all the way to America for trading. They move into Eastern Europe and down into the Arab land, Islamic world, and the Mediterranean, and so on. So quite an achievement, really. I mean, for a bunch of people who were outside the mainstream Christian culture and so on, but to have such a big direct and in some cases indirect impact upon the history of Europe and beyond was quite important and I think significant for me in that sense.